Tim Cook goes to Zhongnanhai. You could call that the White House of China, and pledges to invest, not spend, invest $275 billion over the next 5 years. One, that's $55 billion a year. The CHIPS Act, right? Joe Biden's flagship policy to bring chip fabrication back to America is $53 billion over 4 years. That was called a once-in-a-century investment. I thought, maybe people will resonate with the connection that this is like a Marshall Plan, thinking that maybe the Marshall Plan is, only double the spending or triple the spending. It's half the spending. I know it sounds nuts without the context to say that Apple had a nation-building like impact or a Marshall Plan like impact on China, but the numbers totally back it up. I mean, the Marshall Plan included food aid. There's no food aid in the Cook Plan. It is all about high-end electronics. The Marshall Plan was 16 countries. The Cook Plan is 1 country. There is no hyperbole comparing this to the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan looks like a lemonade stand versus what Apple does in China.
A warm welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by Patrick McGee. He is a Canadian-born business journalist, Financial Times correspondent, and author of Apple in China, The Capture of the World's Greatest Company. Patrick, welcome to Decouple.
Thanks, Chris. Happy to be here.
So you have been making the rounds, my friend. I've seen you on The Daily Show, Channel 4. Sounds like you're kind of 24/7 on podcast circuit right now. Really appreciate you making the time.
Well, look, I hope it's because the book is good, but I'm all too aware that the timing of the book, which has nothing to do with me, is spectacular. And as good as my publicist team is, it's hard to rival my chief publicist, which is Donald Trump, literally putting iPhone-specific tariffs out into the world. So that locked up a number of interviews.
We were mutually pleased by that in the context of this interview. So in the West, we've been having a sort of a collective holy shit moment. It's been happening for each of us in different ways. Basically, this sense that China is catching up, has caught up, is ahead. For me, I'm not a car guy at all, but something came across my Instagram, a Western, he's a car influencer, and he's doing a BYD thing on the Yang U8 SUV, and my God, it's got everything in it, right? I mean, it's 0 to 100 in 3.6 seconds. Massive range. It's got a built-in karaoke system. And, being in a new car, like I drive a shitty old car, right? But when I go on my friend's like new Tesla, I'm like, I just time traveled to the future. Like I'm living in 2025 all of a sudden. I go back to, 2010 in my shitty little car. But in any case, like there's this rising sort of anxiety, which I think your book is really tapping into. Why don't you just give us the summary then of what your book is positing essentially, that Apple has played a real significant role in terms of these capacities that we're becoming aware of.
I like the way you're framing it because I could see someone saying like, I don't care about Apple history. I don't need to read this book. But I'm trying to tell a story of how China became dominant in tech. But I don't think you'll read the story if I named it, China's emergence of a supply chain superpower or something like that. I mean, that would just be a narrow audience. If I can tell the same story, but through the eyes of the world's sexiest company, who, you probably have thousands of dollars worth of their products. And I don't mean you, I mean anyone who's listening to the podcast. I mean, that is just like the norm for a lot of people in the West, frankly, even globally. So, yeah, I mean, the story, I guess, like when I pitched the story, it was really just about Apple being stuck in China, that the competencies that China has are such that at the scale and demand for quality, at the demand for low cost, high margin products that Apple is building, there really is no place else on the planet where they can build this sort of stuff. I mean, we're really talking about like experts struggle to understand the order of magnitude superiority that the Chinese manufacturing topography offers. The surprising thing in the development of the research of talking to more than 200 people was the thesis that China got to where it is largely because of Apple playing this completely outsized role relative to how large its own workforce is in essentially sending America's top engineers to hundreds of factories across China to train, audit, supervise, teach engineering 101, and indeed install machinery worth hundreds of millions of dollars and later billions of dollars on the production line. So these suppliers that create the next generation of components for Apple aren't coming to Apple saying, you'll never guess what we created. Apple is going in there and co-inventing not just the parts, but the processes, the manufacturing complexities, if you will, behind those parts, right? Elon Musk sometimes calls this the machine that creates the machine. And so, in the early 2000s, like Shenzhen is a maker of, crappy products, toys and plastics and, it's just known for its cheap stuff, not its quality stuff. And Apple, more than any other company, really plays a role teaching the Chinese the competence to really build stuff at ridiculously high yield is the manufacturing jargon term. In other words, if you build 100 products, how many of them can actually be delivered to the final consumer without defect? And Apple really cares about things like yield, and they teach, what Steve Jobs called giving a shit to the Chinese. Like you could say this about any number of companies, but it would not be that meaningful because, as I like to joke, like, what's your favorite Dell computer from the early 2000s, right? There is no favorite computer for Dell because there is no Johnny Ive at Dell. There's no imperfection of defects at Dell. I'm not trying to harp on Dell, HP, Gateway, anyone. They don't have the design sensibilities, the taste, the aesthetics that Apple has. And to build those products at scale, like, it's not a knock against the Chinese. Nobody knew how to build this stuff. It's people responding to Johnny Ive's demands and coming up with methods to do it. So in a sense, you could say Cupertino had the skill, China had the scale, and it was that marriage that really created Apple, but really interestingly created China.
And this is really significant. I was looking at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. They have a critical technology tracker. Back in the early 2000s, they said China was leading in 3 of 64 technologies. They're tracking things like biotech, AI, drones, sensors, optics, that kind of stuff. 2023, they're up to 37, leading in 37 of them. 2024, up to 57 out of 64 technologies.
Wow. I'm actually not familiar with those numbers. I mean, that totally tracks. And I would almost wonder what they're looking at, because sometimes we make the mistake of looking at profit share. And when you do that, America comes out looking good because we have a sort of shareholder first, maximize the profits form of capitalism. And China does not have that model. So China comes to dominate industries in such a way that it deindustrializes other rivals, but it doesn't show up in the balance sheet because profits are not what they're after. It's a different form of capitalism that prioritizes command and control, not maximizing shareholder returns.
And with, I think in the book you talk about this, I mean, the big EV companies, what I referenced in the beginning there in terms of my kind of aha or holy shit moment. People talk about EVs as, phones on wheels, or maybe drones as, phones with not wings, but rotors, robots, etc. You're really suggesting that, I mean, there's obviously a lot going on here in terms of strategic industrial policy more broadly, but that Apple is kind of this sensei, I guess. It's such a kind of ruthless sensei in the dojo that it accelerates dramatically. What I probably would have happened, but maybe would you say that it sort of put China ahead sort of 10 years in a lot of these critical strategic industries?
I haven't put it in years, so don't make me make a fool of myself by trying to make a guess there. I don't know. But I should say, as ludicrous as the thesis can sound, if I haven't done the hand-holding through 400 pages, by the way, and I should say, a lot of readers, basically, they will hear a clip of me giving some numbers, like how much Apple invested in the country, and they think it sounds just ludicrous. And frankly, it is ludicrous. Like, it sounds unhinged. And then they get to the end of the 400 pages and they go, it's actually kind of common sense once you think about it. And it's like, yeah, absolutely it is. Because if you understand the scale of Apple products and how they built them in China, then of course there was technology transfer on an epic scale. And so it's really funny sort of having to debate people on social media where one half is saying this is actually kind of obvious, and the other half saying, like, this sounds totally unhinged. And it's like, well, you've either read the book or you haven't,
Exactly.
essentially.
That's the litmus test.
So the other thing I should say is that the Huawei founder has referred to the Huawei founder has referred to Apple as the teacher. All too familiar with the fact that the reason why the suppliers Huawei is able to rely on for its next generation in phones, the reason they're so good is that Apple has trained them all. So my kind of quip on this, right, is that we think in the West that iPhone killed Nokia, but iPhone never had more than 20% market share globally. Nokia had a far higher market share. So who killed Nokia? The answer is the Chinese competition. And the Chinese competition was in a position to do that because Apple trained all of their suppliers. I like that you say an EV is a smartphone on wheels, because basically what that's pointing to is that if you train all these suppliers how to build smartphones, they don't just sort of stick with what you've taught them and they don't innovate on their own, or they don't think about where else the market is for their competencies. And so an EV, a smartphone on wheels, is sort of the next place to go. Drones is the next place to go. I mean, if you're learning at the hand of Apple how to build electronics at scale and in great quality, then of course you use those skills for other things. So Apple sort of gives birth to the Chinese smartphone market, because if you're a supplier making any sort of component for Apple at the clip of tens or hundreds of millions per year, then of course you try to find other ways to maximize your market share, or to some extent your profits, by supplying to Apple's closest rivals in China, and then you use it for other fields, so EVs and drones, and in a scary way, military weaponry.
In terms of what's special about Apple products and how they synergize with this ecosystem, and as you're mentioning, Apple grabbing some of America's top engineering talent fresh out of school and sending them an airplane straight to China to start sort of downloading and transferring these skills. This isn't like a joint venture transfer of Apple IP, but this is a transfer of the know-how. So maybe you could describe that a bit for our listeners.
Yeah, I mean, let me make a point that I'm not making often enough in podcasts. And it really is just a paragraph or two of the book. I mean, if you read the book is really dense. It's not sort of a magazine article that's been padded out. There is just new information. It's like a fire hose of information, really just every page spanning continents and spanning decades. So one point I would make is I'm not even really suggesting there's a transfer of knowledge from America to China. It's much worse than that. It's from the globe to China, because Apple had a specific team of SMEs, subject matter experts, and their whole job, these are basically PhDs, in things like chemistry, would be to go through factories in Japan, Switzerland, Germany, places that had really great automation, places that knew how to make Rolex watches, and they would figure out what the great technology would be for like the next component of the iPhone, and then they would sign a private deal with those companies and then go scale the hell out of it in China. So the technology transfer that China ends up receiving from Apple is really global in nature, which is really quite scary because, again, I do think China practices capitalism, but it's a form of capitalism quite distinct from our own. And the better that China does in these categories, the more all of its rivals become industrialized and, deindustrialized. And Apple doesn't really mean to in the earliest stages, but it basically has played a monumental role here. And so, I mean, I really compare Apple transferring its technology into China and consolidating its production into China to a geopolitical event akin to the fall of the Berlin Wall, but it's an event that played out over the last 25 years rather than, one night when the wall came down. And of course, it took place in a censored media landscape where all the actors who knew what you were doing have been under NDA. So that's why we don't know the story. And so, I'm not trying to just sell books with this hyperbole here. I really do think it's the biggest untold story in tech for the last quarter century.
And of course, this technology transfer is accidental, almost not in terms of the transfer of technology, but the implications that you're describing here. Maybe it's started to in the last 5 or 10 years become a little bit more apparent. But
Yes.
let's get into that a bit later. I really want to understand on a kind of granular level why Apple chose China, why there was such a comparative advantage there. You talk in the book about this floating labor pool, for instance. I want to get nitty gritty into what the factory floor looked like, I guess, back then. Maybe it's changed now, but what made this symbiosis so incredibly profitable? There's that joke that boomers always tell, if you could go back in time and advise your younger self, what do you tell them? Buy Apple stock, in the late 90s, right? There's an incredible amount of value that was extracted or created in this process. Innovation is a part of it, but part of it is exploitation of workers. I want to get a granular sense of what that looked like, these factors, what they look like now.
One is that I think readers are going to be surprised once they get past the introduction that all of a sudden they're back in 1996. And I know sometimes that can be jarring. It's like you get a biography of someone that you love, and then you're reading several chapters about their grandparents, and you're like, this isn't what I wanted. But I had to tell the story of Apple moving from in-house manufacturing, which is what they do for decades, right? From the early 1980s onwards, Apple is building its own computers, even its own circuit boards in California, Ireland, and Singapore. When it adopts an outsourcing slash offshoring model, really before Steve Jobs comes back, and that's important. This is not just a decision of Tim Cook, who comes in 1998. Their original suppliers basically replicate this triple continent strategy. So the translucent iMac that most people remember, I mean, I had it in Tangerine back in 1999. That was built by LG in Korea. And then then LG, at the behest of Apple, expands to do production in Mexicali, Mexico, just south of California, like literally a few miles, and in Wales. So like that's just a story that people don't really know. And then when LG is sort of displaced over time by Foxconn, Foxconn is still doing the triple continent thing. So yes, they're in China, and it's worth knowing that Foxconn is Taiwanese, not Chinese. But they're also doing it in Fullerton, California, and they're also doing it in the Czech Republic. So I tell this like 7-year experimentation story where China is not necessarily the answer. It is one of 8 or 9 countries where Apple is doing the production of its computers, Taiwan and Singapore being two other prominent examples. Um, but basically, if you have like an Excel sheet of where you're producing stuff, especially if it's the same product, and you're comparing the costs in China versus Europe versus North America, China is winning every time on cost, on efficiency, on just what they're capable of. And so, I know some people think the book is just on the title, etc. It's going to be anti-Apple. It's not. I know some people think it's going to be anti-China. It's not. I mean, China earns its place. When I say Apple is the great teacher, I'm not diminishing the importance of the students. In the same way, if I say Harvard is a great teacher or a great university, I'm not diminishing, someone who graduated from there. Of course, I'm not. I'm giving all kinds of credit to the Chinese for having world-leading industrial capability, world-leading work ethic, 12-hour work days, all sorts of things that you and I wouldn't want to do. So what China is offering is really like, why do they win out? Is that, I mean, there are a host of policy measures, right? So places like Shenzhen are these early like experimentation zones. They're called bonded zones where you're exempt from all sorts of tax. And labor pools are coming in literally over decades by the hundreds of millions, where people are coming in from the rural hinterlands to work in these factories. And I actually really dispute the idea that this is slave labor. I've got a book by my foot here called I Slavery. And I mean, I'm not saying these jobs are good, but you've got to understand that the people going to work in Shenzhen 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, they're doing that because that's a much better prospect than toiling in the fields in Western China for 14 hours a day under the hot sun. That's a terrible existence, and it's far better pay to do a sort of 4-year stint in Shenzhen, where you could basically have a dowry and like go live back in your Western village if you wanted to, for the next decade. I mean, they can earn all kinds of money. The wages are just really low by our standards, but not by Shenzhen standards. And this floating population, that's what this is called. I mean, it's literally a number counted in the Chinese census. I believe the last figure was 300 million. So just like have that digest for a second. I mean, that alone is 10 times the population of Canada. It's larger than the labor force of all of America. And these are rural migrants who are not allowed to put down roots in urban settings. So if you're in Western China as a Chinese rural person and you go to live in Shenzhen, I mean, your kids cannot go to the local school. So your kids, if you have them, are going to be raised by your parents, right? So the kids are raised by their grandparents in Western China. This is really problematic in certain degrees because if we're like, oh, what do we do to compete with China? Well, are we going to adopt that in the West? I mean, it's kind of a terrible practice, right? It's really short-termism in a sense on China's part. But I just mean like, I guess I'm pointing it out because on the one hand, that's kind of the secret sauce of China's industrial prowess. Because as companies like Foxconn offer what we call manufacturing as a service, the value of that is Apple is not paying Foxconn when the Foxconn workers are not building Apple products, right? It is not a fixed cost. It is a variable cost. You are only paying for it when the people are there. And Foxconn is brilliant using the state because state-sponsored buses go to the West and come up with pick up these migrants. And so it's a really efficient capital. I mean, they're out capitalizing. How am I saying this? Like they're better at capitalism than we are, but using methods that we would not want to replicate ourselves. So not only are they beating us in a host of ways like labor wages and things like that, but they're sort of beating us philosophically because we're never going to compete with that in the West.
Can you talk about the products themselves? Because you look at an iPhone. I mean, from your book, I learned there's something like 1,000 little sub modules that are part of the final assembly. Everything has to be done to such precision. With our current sort of techno moment, we'd assume it's going to be little machines that are doing this, right? But this sounds very, very labor intensive. Describe just what's happening on the shop floor, the division of labor, this insane sort of assembly line, Adam Smith division of labor.
Yeah, really taken to an extreme where you've got a conveyor belt system where, you're working on something that takes 9 to 11 seconds and you're just doing that with few breaks for 12 hours a day in factories the size of football fields, line after line, where there might be 300,000 people, 500,000 people at a single site or a single industrial cluster, I should say, probably multiple sites, but all next door. It's called next door manufacturing when you sort of have, the metal stamping, the tooling, the other machining, the plastic injection molding, the CNC machining, all within, a stone's throw, let's say, of final assembly. The misperception that people get is that if they understand, okay, so the iPhone's actually a handcrafted device, like that's what sort of makes it a luxurious product, they say, well, why can't you just automate this? There is wild automation in the iPhone process, right? Anything that can be automated is automated. There might be future advances in what can be automated, certainly, but if it can be automated, Apple's already done it. So it is both highly automated and labor intensive. This is not an either or thing. It is both. When people say, why not just automate everything and bring it back to America? There's sort of a couple problems there. Like one, the dexterity and nimbleness of human workers is really just so much greater than what a machine is capable of, particularly because building an iPhone is not like building a car where you set up the production line and in effect you build the same car for the next 7 years. Like that's sort of the product cycle for a car. The iPhone, you're sort of building at massive quantity in a matter of 6 months, and then it really tapers off. And then the next iPhone is developed, and it's got different components, different battery, different processor, and so forth. And even if even if the differences in size are quite minute, that's enough to have to retool the whole assembly line, reprogram all the machinery and everything. So one smart reason, and I don't think people know this, why Apple continues to sell older model iPhones, right? Like we're at the model 16 right now, but you can probably still buy the 15, maybe even 14, and certainly the lower end models like the SE, which sort of, are continuing to use the chassis and other components that they've had years later. It's because those phones are being far more automated. There's less labor intensity the more that you're able to sell these phones for multiple years. So versus 10 years ago, when you really just had a new iPhone and you got rid of the past one, Apple is actually sort of flexing its automation capabilities by having multiple phones. And so the new ones have more labor intensity than the old ones.
I want to keep going a little bit more on this because I think it's also quite illustrative of why, contrary to Trump's hopes and maybe what Tim Cook is trying to promise, you can't just take iPhones and build them here in the U.S. So we've talked about this incredible roving labor pool, the size and scale of these factories. I understand some are producing 500,000 units every single day, but also just these industrial clusters. There's a place called iPhone City, for instance. Just walk us through a little bit more of that supply chain stuff. I know you wrote this book and you said it was sort of a trick to get people to read about supply chains in a sexy way. I mean, I love reading about supply chains, so we can go a little deeper on this. But again, I want to get fairly granular in terms of building the case as to why it's not such an easy thing to just say, okay, we're going to have a tariff policy, we're going to force manufacturing, and we'll be able to do it in the U.S., for instance.
Yeah. So there's a former manufacturing design engineer who's been quoted frequently, and I really like this quote. He said, Zhengzhou, a portion of which is called iPhone City. I mean, that has 500,000 people working on the iPhone at peak season. And so he compares this to the city of Boston, also about 500,000 people, really giving up everything they're doing and they're working on iPhone instead. So, picture the Ally McBeal office, and nobody's going to be a lawyer anymore. We're all going to make iPhones, right? But every city block, every person in Boston deciding to do that. I actually think he's underestimating the challenge, because not only is it that, it's the city of Boston working on something else for a long time and then sort of floating over to Milwaukee to build the iPhone and then floating over to Buffalo to build something else or whatever, right? So it's not just that you have the density of population working on this stuff, it's that they're dynamic and that they go from one area to the next. We are just never going to compete with that. Even if we adopted that model, as insane as that is, we would still be doing so at a rate of labor that is never going to be competitive with China. And we would be doing it without the same sophisticated industrial clusters and automation. I think I'm right in saying that the number of robots China has on the production line is greater than the rest of the world combined. And frankly, even if I happen to be wrong by that, I'm not going to be wrong by 2030. That is the trajectory of everything that's going on. I believe the stat is that by 2030, China will be manufacturing more than the rest of the world combined. So experts in industrial supply chains really struggle to even comprehend or articulate the degree of superiority China has in advanced manufacturing. The idea that we're going to be competitive, I mean, I think I've named 3 or 4 reasons. There's probably 20 reasons. It is just not going to happen. That's not to say that we shouldn't be, trying. I would love to see a revival of industrial might in America. But I think the real answer is not reshoring, it's friend-shoring. So I would like to see NAFTA on steroids. I would like to see Foxconn and others being pushed kicking and screaming to India. Allied nations where the sort of Pax Americana growth of Germany after World War II, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea. This was all a net good for these countries. It was a net good for the world. The trouble is we tried to do it with a communist country of more than 1 billion people who is so large that they don't just participate in the American-led world order, they seek to overthrow it. That was a strategic error on our part. It was probably born of hubris. I don't really think the argument was made in bad faith. Like, I don't think it's I don't think you have to throw Bill Clinton or Larry Summers or any number of people under the bus for allowing China into the World Trade Organization. I think we had a real strategic sense that this was going to be a net good, that a middle class was going to develop in China and, in effect, overthrow the communist authority. But clearly, in retrospect, that didn't happen, and we're just dealing with the consequences right now. The point of my book is really to get people more conversant in that conversation, but I'm not going to do it if I write a wonky tome on China's role in the World Trade Organization or, supply chain 101. So I'm selling you on the sex appeal of Apple products, but hopefully getting you conversant in why this is such a big deal for who controls hegemony in the 21st century.
Yeah, in that unipolar world moment, I think there was such a sense of hubris that liberal democracy would inevitably flourish in China, and that through globalization and extending capitalism into China, that we would be doing something, doing a good there, and it hasn't quite played out the way we thought.
Yeah, and I refer to the iPhone as a catalyst not for globalization, but for Chinification. I contrast that with the IBM PC in 1981, which really gave birth to electronics contract manufacturing. Maybe didn't mean to, but that's what it did. And the impact of the iPhone has really been quite different. The last 10 years have really been a case study in an American-made product becoming more and more Chinese. The real estate within the iPhone is increasingly Chinese. The multinationals operating in China are being squeezed out by the quote-unquote red supply chain, who have better access to the state, which gives them an ability to operate at lower margins because they get free labor, not free labor, just better access to labor, free machinery, free land, and so forth. I mean, China has this like Nietzschean will to power, and they're going to dominate through manufacturing. The epigraph of my book is quoting a 2015 document from Beijing that says, without manufacturing, there is no country and there is no nation. Find me a country comparable to China that has that as their motto. Um, it's really tough to compete with.
And it's made itself the indispensable manufacturing nation, certainly for Apple, which I guess has made the choice to localize more than 90% of its supply chain in China. Obviously, you're chasing quarterly results. At a certain point, there must have been a moment where I'm not sure if any of your sources told you about this, but I would have to hope that someone must have said, "Hey, we're putting too many eggs in one basket here." But I guess, was it just too lucrative, and would have been too much of an expense to try and start diversifying away from somewhere where it just works so well to build these devices?
So one of the earliest products that really does consolidate to China is the iPod, particularly the iPod Mini. So the classic iPod is built by Inventec in Taiwan. And then it begins to go so well that Inventec says to Apple, hey, we need to set up another factory and we're going to do it in China. And then for the iPod Mini, Foxconn, who's been a partner of Apple for several years at this point, basically believes that we're not involved in the most popular products of Apple right now. We're not doing their desktop computer anymore because they weren't selected for what's called the iMac G4. It looks like a sunflower that was built by Quanta in Taiwan, and then later at a place called QSMC, Quanta Shanghai Manufacturing. And they're not building the iPod. That's Inventec. And so Foxconn's worries that they're losing their partnership with Apple. And so they literally design a replica iPod and have a bunch of people come over to their facility. And it's basically show and tell. And it's a show and tell of two things. One, the replica to say, look, you didn't even train us to do this. Look how damn good this thing is. And Apple people that are there are saying, this looks like we designed the hardware and the software. Like, this is amazing. It's basically Foxconn orchestrated a job interview for themselves. And then they show them the facilities and they basically say, look what we've already built. All of this is for you. This is at your disposal. Foxconn is brilliant at luring in Apple.
I guess we could jump a little bit into here, because in terms of this transfer, you mentioned in your book, there's a Marshall Plan scale investment into this manufacturing ecosystem. But also, again, that America's best engineers are being taken right out of graduation and basically flown on a jet straight to China. Like, what is being transferred? You mentioned millions of workers are being trained. I just want to get a better sense of how this all works.
The topography of Apple that had never really been described before is what's called the pyramid structure. So most people, even without knowing what the pyramid structure is, are familiar with the top of the pyramid. This is ID, industrial design. This is about 24 people in the golden age of Apple, led by Johnny Ive. It's that team that comes up with, we're going to use translucent plastics, and these are going to be the colors. It's that team that comes up with the iPhone is going to be all unapologetically white, and it's going to have a scroll wheel, and it's going to be chrome on the back. They sort of kick it over to product design, PD. This is a bigger team within the pyramid. basically are a bunch of engineers who have to figure out like, okay, this is what Johnny Ive is demanding. How do we actually make this thing function? How do we fit in all the electronics? What is the circuit board going to look like? What kind of battery can we fit in there? It's another level of genius, but it's different from ID. After that is MD, manufacturing design. To be fair, these guys don't quite exist as their own distinct unit until 2008, 2010. And for a long time, they're called supply-based engineers, but let's just skip over that. That's footnotes. MD is the team of engineers who fly over to Asia to co-invent the parts and the processes behind those parts to fulfill the vision of ID and PD. So in other words, Johnny Ive's team comes up with some mind-bending design, but nobody actually knows how to build it. I mean, literally nobody in the world knows how to build a computer that looks like a sunflower. It's never been done before. I mean, you literally have this like chrome neck that's based on precipitously hardened metal at an aerospace grade, and Apple has to like corner the market on this metal. Like they're literally competing with companies that are doing like vacuums for semiconductors and aerospace sector in order to get their hands on this metal. And Apple begins to operate at such quantities that their procurement team literally has to do the negotiating themselves because they need to make sure down multiple tiers they're going to have enough raw materials to be able to like go through various factories to get it all refined and everything. So Apple begins to take unprecedented control of this sort of stuff, not just the manufacturing, but the logistics and the negotiation for those prices. Nobody else is doing this. If you're a Western PC company, you're basically hoping the component makers come up with innovations where the materials become more durable, maybe better looking, and lighter or something like that. Apple's not doing that. Apple is working hand in glove with the suppliers to co-invent the very things that will be in the next computer or the next phone or what have you. So this is where the transfer of knowledge is just enormous. But I guess what I say, one way of saying it is that Cupertino has the skill, it doesn't have the scale. It finds the scale in China, and that's where you get the perfect marriage because China has this like drive to indigenously innovate, right? To move up the value chain, to learn all of this stuff. And that's where it begins to see that there's this great irony that in order to really become a leader in indigenous innovation, they realize you work with the mother of all capitalist companies to get that into effect. You work with Apple.
I mean, this sounds like, Japanese Meiji Restoration kind of thing, right? Go find the Prussians and bring them in to teach you infantry how to work. Go find, the Navy in the UK and get them to teach you how to form a Navy and then go and beat the Russians, a few years later.
So yes and no. So China has something called the Thousand Talents program, and it's explicitly that, right? It's like go find a professor at Oxford who can teach something or other and bring them into China. This is sort of happening under the radar. Like Apple is doing this on their own without Beijing even understanding what they're doing from 2003 to 2012. And like to such an extent that the book opens with Xi Jinping becoming president and effectively through CCTV attacking Apple because he sees Apple as an exploitative power. I mean, Apple is just operating from afar. Nobody senior is living in the country. They don't really have anyone senior doing government affairs. They don't understand the culture. They don't understand the politics. They, in effect, don't need to. They are just having engineers fly into all these factories to such an extent, by the way, that United Airlines is literally taking new routes to cities in China that they don't go to just to serve Apple because Apple says we will buy enough first-class seats 3 times a week to go to Chengdu, to go to Hangzhou, that if the rest of the plane is empty, you will still be making money. So I point that out just because that is not the case for the Google Pixel team. Okay, that is not the case for the Facebook advertising team. Apple is unique in terms of how many people it is sending to China, and it's affecting other industries like the airline industry. I mean, it's just on an absurd sort of level.
So again, they haven't formed this joint venture. There's not any out in the open technology transfer. We've talked about everything that's going on in terms of what they are transferring. And at a certain point, as you mentioned, Xi through this what is it, a accountability day for bad corporate behavior,
Consumer Day,
gives Apple a smack. Tell that story, and then how Apple makes the case, I guess, to Xi Jinping that they're in fact contributing massively to China, just doing it in their own special way. And I guess making explicit what was implicit before.
So Consumer Day is a program watched by millions of people in China. It's March 15th every year. It goes back to 1991. Effectively, a bunch of local companies in the 90s are called out for not living up to the socialist ethos. It's like this really well-produced program where hidden cameras go into these shops and they find out what the policies are and find out that Chinese consumers are being screwed this way or that way or whatever. What happens is Western companies sort of get involved in the late 2010s. So in 2012, McDonald's is the big enemy for food violations. And in 2013, 36 hours after Xi Jinping becomes president, Apple is called out. Now, they're called out for warranty differences. The claim is that, with their hidden cameras, they go present problems to, let's say, a French Apple store, and they find that, if the phone just isn't working upon purchase, the French store says, "Oh, my apologies. Here is a new iPhone." And in China, the same thing happens, and it's not "here is a new iPhone." It is, "Let me take your phone. We will take it for 30 days. We'll refurbish it and give it back to you." And so the Chinese are like, "Wait a minute, we're being treated this an inferior way. This arrogant company is exploiting the Chinese consumer." And China's coming off of its century of humiliation, it's called, right, where it's taken advantage of with the exploitative powers who obviously annexed Taiwan. They sort of play a role in the opium wars. I mean, they're called that because Britain, against the will of China, is exporting opium, sort of the pre-modern equivalent of fentanyl, to the country and having this disastrous effect. So China is very sensitive to being taken advantage of. But there's this riddle that I basically solve. I solved this after I submitted the first manuscript by getting better sourcing of why the warranty differences existed. And the reason why is this totally wild story. This is my favorite part of the book. It's part 4. It's called Insatiable Demand. And it's that the iPhone becomes such a conspicuous status symbol in 2010 with the iPhone 4 that there's this massive there's this massive supply-demand imbalance in China, to such an extent that these gangsters, these quasi-gangsters with triad connections known as the yellow cows, notice this, and they try to begin amassing as many iPhones as they can. I mean, literally tens of thousands of iPhones, so that they can take them to other cities. The problem is Apple won't sell you tens of thousands of iPhones. They'll sell you 2. So at the Beijing store in Sanlitun district, they begin bussing in hundreds and later thousands of migrants to stand in line, literally circling around the store with 6,000-7,000 people. And so, it's worth knowing, like, these are not fanboys of Apple. This isn't like you and I getting excited about the latest iPhone and camping out the night before, which is the sort of stuff you see in the West. These are migrants who can't actually afford the phone, but they're being given the exact same amount of cash. And if you sort of picture that conveyor belt logic of how you build an iPhone, that's how busy the store gets, where they're just sort of taking the same amount of cash. Here's your iPad, here's your iPhone, moving on to the next thing. And they're processing just an insane level of transaction. I mean, they're setting world records, selling something like 25,000 phones per store each day until inventory is cleared. They're actually having to only sell iPhones between 8 in the morning and 10 in the morning, because if they sell them all day, your ordinary customer is not able to go into the store. I mean, we're talking about such level of demand that someone sells on the black market. They undergo black market surgery to sell a kidney in exchange for a new iPhone and a new iPad. Apple is totally flummoxed by this demand. They don't know what to do. They have researchers standing outside the Apple store talking to people, ordinary buyers, who once in a while can buy the phone. And they say, like, who are you? What's your income? Why did you buy the iPhone? And like among these people is a mailman who spent 30% of his annual salary to buy a new iPhone. And he says to them, when people see me with the iPhone, I'm not just a mailman. So the demand is just totally off the charts. Now, the crazy thing that goes on here, and I'm sorry I'm trying to really sum this up in 3 minutes or whatever, but this is 4 chapters, including the prologue, is that you have to remember that the yellow cows are backed by triad organizations, and they're greedy, and they're making loads of money. They begin finding ways to go to America, go to a T-Mobile shop, a Verizon shop with a fake identification, and they buy a phone under a 24-month contract. They pay the first month with no intention of ever paying the 23 months. So in other words, they find a way, illegal, to buy an iPhone for less than $100, right? And then they're able to still sell it in a city like Chongqing, population 32 million, number of Apple stores 0, and sell it for $800 or $900. A way of saying they are making more money per iPhone than Apple. And this is happening every product launch for multiple years. The story is wild. Now, savvy listeners will be like, you can't take an iPhone from America and use it in Canada. That's true. So with factory connections, they zap the processor. They render the phone inoperable, but at the same time, they are masking the retail market of origin. So at the Genius Bar, someone's looking at the iPhone and being like, I can confirm this is a new phone. I don't know why it works. There must be a supply chain problem. My bad. Here is a brand new phone in a sealed box. So this is described to me as like cocaine to the yellow cows. But of course, as this happens, I mean, we're literally talking about people, instead of snaking around the front of the store, they're snaking around the Genius Bar line, and they're unloading backpacks full of iPhones and saying, none of these work and they're all new. And so Apple is obviously catching on that there's something going on here, but they don't really know what it is. And this is the origin of them saying, let's wait 30 days. Let's send this to Singapore where we have a logistics hub. We're going to refurbish the phone. And in that time, they're trying to figure out, like, how has this phone been tampered with? Because the yellow cows are so damn good at this that beyond what I already said, which is already really sophisticated, they were also taking apart the phone, hollowing it out, and then putting replica components inside that didn't actually function or weren't actually Apple authorized. And so they could make money selling the components like the memory in a market in Shenzhen
No
and
way.
then hand it back to Apple and get a brand new phone. This goes on for 8 years. And if you've ever wondered why today's phones are such a pain in the neck for right to repair activists, it's because everything in the phone is now serialized to the motherboard. But it's serialized to the motherboard because Apple had this problem of people scamming them with all these fake components in their iPhone. So like I'm sympathetic to why Apple's so like adamant with everything has to be an Apple component. It's because they were being screwed. So anyway, so this is the origin story of why the phone has to be refurbished. So Apple wasn't really treating the Chinese in an inferior way, but that's the allegation because it is based on a truth that there was a warranty difference, but it's because Apple was dealing with scammers on an epic scale. All of this is new, by the way. I mean, none of this has been reported, so it's just a wild story.
Apple definitely needs China. Does China still need Apple anymore? I mean, what's happening here with Xi flexing his muscles, potentially using this consumer rights moment to his favor, and Apple then having to prove themselves and their loyalty in terms of the kind of investments that they end up making as a result.
Yeah, so I don't think China needs Apple anymore. I think the student has become the master. Chinese smartphone makers have 55% market share, and they're no longer just mimicking the iPhone. You actually get better phones coming out of China now. So the Huawei Mate XT is a phone that literally unfolds twice. So it's a little bit thicker than an iPhone, but that once you unfold it, like a trifold, it becomes the size of an iPad. So it's sort of a two-in-one product at a time when Apple phones can't unfold once. The Chinese competition is designing and shipping phones that unfold twice. It costs $2,800, and so people sort of criticized it. And it's like, you're totally missing the point here. It was just 10 years ago that Xiaomi was being blamed for, brazenly copying the iPhone and then selling it at, a fraction of the price. And now we're actually having, Chinese smartphone makers that are doing things the iPhone cannot do and getting a premium, selling them in the millions. That's quite an extraordinary change for what was in effect a 11 or 12-year period. So that's sort of amazing. In other words, China didn't get the lesson of how to fold an iPhone from Apple, right? They now have their own world-class designers and engineers who can do that on their own. Where I would say Apple is still teaching is if you've ever tried the Vision Pro headset, I mean, it is a market failure because it doesn't really have any content. There's very little that you can do with the damn thing, but nevertheless, it is an absolute marvel of technology. And that is made by Luxshare, not a Taiwanese company, a Chinese competitor to the Taiwanese, part of the Red supply chain, in fact, the most successful, but sometimes in the market worth more than Foxconn, despite having a fraction of the orders. But it's because Chinese investors see the writing on the wall and they know that the political connections Luxshare has to the party will result in greater and greater orders. So, I mean, that's a heavily automated device, and Apple is absolutely teaching Luxshare how to do it. Otherwise, Luxshare wouldn't know how to build it. So just to sum up, maybe more directly answer your question, I don't really see Beijing going after Apple. I mean, there's two main reasons why they wouldn't do that. One is that Apple does continue to be a teacher. Why would you get rid of someone who's voluntarily handing you the gift of fire on an annual basis, teaching you the latest techniques coming out of Caltech, coming out of MIT? Apple will hire from SpaceX and Tesla and then have those people go to China. I mean, it just makes no sense to go after Apple. I mean, why would you do it? They're just too beneficial. The other reason is that, insofar as those like tariff discussions, like much to the benefit of my book, people use Apple just as like the paradigmatic example of a Western company manufacturing in China. And no one knows that better than Beijing itself. So if Beijing took drastic action, like, closed a factory in China or whatever, that would instill fear among any number of Western corporations that either do business in China or are thinking about doing business in China. So if they're going to take action against Apple because they're moving to India or something, it's going to be subtle, hard to trace things like an electricity, what am I trying to say? Like an electricity blackout at a certain factory for a few hours, the sort of stuff that wouldn't make national headlines, but would impact Apple without sort of causing the blowback of other Western companies hesitating as to whether or not they're going to build their next product in China.
But you do describe this gang of eight that is assembled in order to sort of convince Xi Jinping of the value proposition of Apple and why, I don't know, why it shouldn't be forced into a joint venture. I'm not sure if those threats were on the books at all. But they made that case, and again, you mentioned this Marshall Plan scale investment. When is that happening?
So yeah, when Apple is attacked by CCTV and state-sponsored media, they really do fear their products are going to be blacklisted. No hyperbole there. Facebook is blacklisted. Google is blacklisted. Apple worries that it's going to be next. The Gang of Eight is a team of executives hired or transferred to China. First time that Apple has senior people living in the country. I mean, this group includes two vice presidents. But it's also people overseeing third-party sales, retail sales, Apple University, R&D, et cetera. So, for instance, Apple has no R&D in the country. Today, they have five labs in China, five different cities, right? That plays a big role employing, higher value people, PhDs and stuff in China, but also just like demonstrating to provincial authorities, not just Beijing, because you have to understand, yeah, our model of how we think of China as a communist power is totally backwards. It's not like the Soviets. It's not a top-down thing. It's really grassroots level up from the cadres on forward. I would describe it as federalism on steroids. So you don't just work with Beijing. You need to work with local officials, and so that's why you have five R&D labs, and that's why they're in five different cities, because you have to placate a number of authorities. So the Gang of Eight really is the team that begins to understand the threat here is that we're going to be forced to do joint ventures. And after lots of research, they realize our impact on China is enormous. And the problem, the reason why they're angry with us, is that they don't know what our impact is. So we need to stop being the secretive company that we always have been. And we need to get this out to the highest echelons of communist power. You have no idea how much we are contributing to the country. Here's what we're doing. And they basically pledge in May 2016, when Tim Cook goes to Zhongnanhai, you could call that the White House of China, and pledges to invest, not spend, invest $275 billion over the next 5 years. I compare that to the Marshall Plan because I could not find any corporate equivalent. If someone has one, please let me know. But instead, I compare it to two things. One, that's $55 billion a year. The CHIPS Act, right? Joe Biden's flagship policy to bring chip fabrication back to America is $53 billion over 4 years. That was called a once-in-a-century investment in American manufacturing by the Commerce Secretary. So Apple was investing the equivalent every year. So you could think of that, a CHIPS Act every year for the last decade. And then the other thing is I thought, maybe people will resonate with the connection that this is like a Marshall Plan, thinking that maybe the Marshall Plan is, only, double the spending or triple the spending. It's half the spending. Apple is investing more than the Marshall Plan invested over 4 years, and they've been doing it for a quarter century. So I know it sounds nuts without the context to say that my argument is that Apple had a nation-building like impact or a Marshall Plan like impact on China, but the numbers totally back it up. I mean, the Marshall Plan included food aid. There's no food aid in the Cook Plan. It is all about high-end electronics. The Marshall Plan was 16 countries. The Cook Plan is one country. I mean, I can just go down the line. Government bureaucrats don't have the same level of efficiency of America's top engineers at a hyper-capitalist, ruthlessly efficient organization. So there is no hyperbole comparing this to the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan looks like a lemonade stand versus what Apple does in China.
Hasn't Tim Cook offered a fairly similarly sized investment in America to Trump most recently, $500 billion?
Yes, but the difference is there's no substance to it. I mean, just think of it this way. Like, some people have some skepticism that Apple invested $55 billion a year. And yet I don't see those same people having any skepticism that Apple's investing what it said in February, which is that $500 billion will be invested in America over the next 4 years. Okay, really? So we're skeptical that they're spending $55 billion a year, where 90% of their production takes place. But we're not skeptical that they're spending $500 billion over the next 4 years, where none of their production takes place? Come on. Give this some common sense. What Apple is counting, most likely, this is my opinion. The math doesn't work unless you do it this way, as far as I can tell. Apple is counting as investment in America, share buybacks and dividends, because 70% of Apple shareholders are in America. So if you are in effect buying, as they do, $100 billion of your own shares per year, then you do the math, you quickly get to at least $400 billion, right? Plus dividends, then multiply by 0.7 so that you're only getting the American investors. That, in a sense, is an investment in America through the shareholder program. That is not, of course, an investment in American manufacturing, but the press release is structured so that you come away thinking that it is without Apple actually explicitly saying that it is. In other words, the Tim Cook quote, maybe the headline, are all about American manufacturing and bringing jobs here, but it's ludicrous. They say they're investing $500 billion and it'll create 20,000 jobs. How bad is your government-run program, if I'm making an analogy here, if you are spending $500 billion and you are only creating 20,000 jobs? None of this makes any sense. It only makes sense if you begin counting shareholder buybacks and dividends as part of the figure.
Okay, but what about the MacBook factory in Texas? Can you describe that? And
Are you
what a
suggesting
roaring
that adds
success
up
that
to
was?
500 billion? No, this is.
No, I just want to hear about what kind of legacy of success we're building on in terms of bringing the supply chain back to
I
America.
spoke to, I think, 7 different people involved with making the Mac Pro in Texas. This also had political origins. So in the 2012 Romney versus Obama debates, Apple sort of got hammered for outsourcing all of their jobs to China. And so their solution was let's create, a low volume product in America to demonstrate our commitment to the country. They were absolutely able to make like a snazzy video of, quite frankly, a bunch of white people putting products together. To such an extent, by the way, that the Chinese were upset because when they show factories in China, they do not show the Chinese faces, right? And so Apple is very clever about how they kind of do this stuff. They understand political optics. I mean, it's Apple.
It wasn't like one of those AI-generated spoof videos that China's been putting out recently of the
Oh my God,
fat-fingered.
those, I mean, to be honest, that's not so different from what happened. So basically, I talked to people who said like the Apple managers are always mad at me because I don't move at China speed, and this is a 50-year-old kind of heavyset white guy. Yeah, so essentially what happens is Apple makes this commitment to Texas. They build a factory. They don't build a factory. They man the factory at a company called Flextronics, since renamed Flex. And, to quote one engineer on the project, it was an unmitigated fiasco. To quote another person, Tim, as in Tim Cook, hated it. You could just tell. I talked to a bunch of people who basically just said it was such a formative experience and just how much better China had become at all of this stuff that you couldn't build it in the heartland of America. Even if you were working with a company like Texas Instruments, location, as the name implies, is Texas. You couldn't get the same sort of prices, the same sort of volumes from that company as you could get it in Asia. And so this is a computer factory where they're trying to churn out 500, 600 units per day. The iPhone is at 1 million per day. So if we can't be building the Mac Pro at those volumes, we sure as hell aren't about to create the iPhone, which is more complex, a smaller product, gets revamped every year, whereas the Mac Pro is every 4 or 5 years. It was just a formative episode in demonstrating the total lack of capacity and know-how and experiential knowledge in America versus that of China. And the only way that, if someone says, oh, but it does exist, I own one, it says made in America. Yeah, very prominently. But guess who built it? A bunch of Chinese employees from Foxconn who were flown over to take care of the job because the Americans couldn't do it. It's devastating, but that's what happened.
What's happening most recently? We had Liberation Day. Apple lost a good chunk, 20% of its market cap, and then ensuing day mayhem around the sort of tariff escalation. I understand that was an exemption was carved out, probably because of Tim Cook and because of the impact on people's portfolios. Catch us up a little bit with what's happening right now and how Apple is trying to adapt, either in real terms or symbolically, to signal that they're not as vulnerable as they've made them out to be in terms of this dependence on the Chinese supply chain.
So I'm glad we've already spoken about the $500 billion investment, because my understanding of how they're getting to $500 billion is not what has been explained to the White House, because the White House press secretary has said it's quite a chunk of change that Apple is investing in America. Like, they really have sort of taken the Kool-Aid from Apple and thought, oh, the company really is reshoring. And so a few months go by, they're sort of like looking around for the press releases or the factories that are being built. And of course, none of it's taking place because $500 billion is not being invested in American reshoring. And so I think it's sort of a problem of Apple's own making. But it's what they did in Trump 1.0. According to Trump, Tim Cook promised 3 big, beautiful factories in America to churn out Apple products. That was in 2017. That's almost a decade ago. None of those factories exist. So I don't think it's unfair to say Tim Cook's strategy was to run the clock on the Trump presidency, and that worked out well. He just didn't know that Trump was coming back 4 years later. So where are they now? I think they're trying to do the same thing, which is that some snazzy press releases will placate Trump. But Trump still has, 1,200 days left in the presidency? It's hard to run out the clock this time, especially when your previous announcements were obviously full of hot air. There are no factories. So I don't know exactly what happens next, but Trump has basically, for the first time in, I think, world history, created a tariff on a single product, or not even a single company, a single product, the iPhone, and basically said, like, I don't care where it's built. If it's not built in America, it's subject to a 25% tariff. Frankly, that tariff is not high enough for Tim Cook to budge at all. I mean, the cost of making an iPhone in Pittsburgh is going to be way more than a 25% premium. So you're not going to change anything. But the Truth Social or tweet or whatever that Trump put out said at least 25%. And Trump is an erratic figure. If Tim Cook doesn't play ball in some way, that figure can go higher and higher. And we've seen him go to 145%, without any warning. So Trump's looking to have something from Apple by the end of June. I mean, this is a ludicrously short period for a supply chain commitment. And then just remember, because I think people kind of forget this sort of stuff when they're thinking about it, Apple doesn't have any manufacturing facilities. So it's not even a matter of Apple saying, okay, damn it, you know what? We're sitting on $100 billion in cash. Let's just spend $3 billion building something. They don't do that. So they have to convince a Foxconn, a Luxshare, a BYD, and hopefully, if you're Trump, a number of others to build the whole industrial clusters to even build this stuff. Because if they just have Foxconn here and all the components are being flown in already sub-assembled for one final step in Texas or something, I mean, the reporters like me are going to say this is basically BS. They're not actually making the iPhone here. They're just assembling it. And the deficit with China is no different because you're just importing all the sub-assembled components. So look, this gets to my point of, so I'm sure that at this point, the listener's like, well, what should they do? And the thing is, like, nothing. There's no great action for them to take. The whole point of my book is this company is great. It's the world's greatest company. And they have been outmaneuvered by a political entity that is a nation state, an authoritarian one that they can't really negotiate in good faith with. Apple is stuck. They are captured. That is the subtitle of the book. It's not hyperbolic. That's the state of affairs.
I'm trying to find like historical precedents for what you describe in your book. One of them was the Gorky Auto Plant, which is where Ford Motors transferred several automotive designs and indeed a whole assembly line and factory over to the Soviet Union in the late 30s. There was no Cold War at that time. The U.S. government didn't stand in the way. They transferred an ability and probably accelerated the Soviet Union's ability to mass produce cars, trucks, then tanks to some degree, but America didn't lose any of its dominance. It dominated automotive manufacturing for the next half century. Maybe I'm thinking of the UK's decline as a manufacturing superpower as the US overtook. This feels more dramatic in a sense and more vulnerable. Maybe I'm just not good enough historian of the UK, for instance, but just looking at this in sort of the grand arc of history, how unique do you think this moment is in terms of, again, the rise of one power and the eclipsing of another?
I think totally unique because the complexity of a 21st supply chain is just orders of magnitude more complex than anything you were doing in the 1930s. I mean, just there's no counter argument. The other thing is that I'm not all that familiar with that episode, but it's not that Ford sort of like shut down Dearborn, Michigan or whatever, River Rouge, and just like exported everything over there. That is what Apple did. I mean, Apple used to have factories, their own factories in multiple states and in multiple countries. They don't have them anymore. So like the closest counterpart contemporaneously is Tesla, because Tesla basically adopts the Apple model and says to the Shanghai officials, including the Shanghai mayor, like, we are going to do for EVs what Apple did for smartphones. And they literally hire Apple employees to execute the plan. So that's a good section of the book. But even so, Tesla does do its own manufacturing. Obviously, it works hand in glove with suppliers. It does play the Apple model, but they actually do build their own stuff. I mean, there are manufacturing plants that say Tesla outside, where the IP is just for Tesla and the higher value stuff is not given to suppliers. So it is different in that respect. It's also different in the respect that even though Shanghai accounts for about 50% of global car production for Tesla, they do have a localized supply chain in Berlin. They do have a localized supply chain in California and in Texas. So they are not nearly as exposed as Apple to an authoritarian churn in China. If in other words, if China annexes Taiwan, I mean, there's no more chips for any other Apple product for the foreseeable future, and potentially no products are coming out of China because if we're at war with China, I think trade basically collapses with them. I would describe that as a meteor strike on Apple's operational business, a meteor strike on Tesla's Shanghai business, but I think for the most part, you would still have things turning along okay in Texas and California and Berlin. I suppose I should asterisk that with, I don't know exactly where the chips are coming for Tesla's cars. So the chances are very high that they do indeed come from TSMC, and I apologize, I'm ignorant there. But nevertheless, they could probably get some high advanced chips from Korea, from Samsung and so forth. Whereas Apple's not really able to do that. And even if they could, their greatest competitor is Samsung. So in the event that China annexes Taiwan, the chief beneficiary, I think, is pretty clearly Samsung. And so that makes it difficult for Samsung, who does not just the smartphone, but they fabricate their own chips, to then supply Apple. I get into this in the book, by the way. So if I'm not being all that articulate now, it is in the book.
All right. Well, dear listeners, it's time to order that book because unfortunately this interview has to come to an end. Patrick, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you for making the time. Look forward to hearing lots of feedback on this episode.
My pleasure. I'm sorry I don't have a nice Canadian, friendly, optimistic note to end the interview on. But yeah, I'm open to being countered or whatever. But unfortunately, I'm pretty pessimistic about the state of China's manufacturing dominance and the role we played in giving it to them.
Well, hopefully this book sparks some conversation on that topic and some problem solving. Thank you again.
Cheers. Thank you.
Today's episode was made possible through a generous donation from the Xerxes Foundation and from listeners like you making pledges on our Substack. If you'd like to join the tribe, please do head over to our Substack, smash that pledge button, or if you would like a tax-deductible receipt, you can hit the donate button and make a contribution through our fiscal sponsor. We genuinely appreciate your support. It is only through your generosity that we are able to continue to offer energy literacy on demand.